So in this video, I'm going to go over the Chapter 10 homework quiz. This is much more fun to do in class. As we saw with the end of Chapter 10, we had the whole class going and determining what color it was going to be. Well, we're short on time, so you can play at home and maybe have some Zoom party with your friends to do this, right? To go over this quiz. But seriously, so in each one of these questions to start with, we're going to have what is the color of the pizza, right? And we have this HTML here, and here is going to be the CSS. So each time we're going to decide whether it's going to be red or orange. As you can see, as I quickly skim through these 6 questions, right? And then the 7th question will be a little different. Okay, so let's get started on here. And again, after I go through the answers, or after I go through the question, you might want to take a moment to, pause the video and think. So in this case, we have the HTML is going to stay the same. So in this case, the CSS specifies div pound lunch space div.intro space em.food, right? And the other one is pound menu space dot row space dot intro and space dot fresh, right? So again, you pause the video here, and when you figured out what the answer is, or when you think you know, let's go through this. So in this case, this one specifies the div, which has an ID of lunch, and then looks inside of that for a div with a class of intro. Right, so this belongs to 2 classes here. And then finally looks inside of that for an EM element that has a class of food. Right, so this specifies the pizza directly. Right, and this one, we look inside something with an ID of menu for something with a class of row, for something inside with a class of intro, for something inside with a class of fresh. Right? So this also specifies the element itself. So when determining which of these 2 to use, right, they're going to have to do battle with each other. They're both the author CSS, so they have the same precedence in that regard. And in the battle, what do we start with? Well, neither of these are important, so we're starting with IDs. So how many IDs does this have? Well, this has 1 ID. And how many IDs does this have? This also has 1 ID. Okay? So we go to the next tiebreaker, which is classes. So how many classes does this have? This rule has 2, but this rule has 3. Right? So this is the winner here, and the color is red. Okay, did you get that? So the next question here, right? And again, you'll want to pause the video. Again, we're talking about the same CSS here, or same HTML here, so it's just the CSS that changes. Okay, so you think you know the answer? How many people say orange? How many people say red? Okay, this is a lot more boring when I make the video. But anyway, we'll go with a div that has an ID of lunch, right? So that specifies this. Look inside for a div with a class of intro. That specifies this. And look inside of that with an EM element that has a class of food, right? So again, we're talking about the element itself. This one is also going to talk about the element itself. We look inside an ID of menu, a class of row, a class of intro. Inside that, we look for a paragraph, and inside that, we look for an EM. So again, both of these specify the element themselves. They're both author CSS, no important stuff going on here. So again, they do battle. This one has 1 ID, and this one has 1 ID. So we go to the next tiebreaker, which is classes. This has 2 classes. This also has 2 classes. So then we go to the next tiebreaker, which is the number of elements, right? And this has 3, whereas this only has 2, right? So the orange wins. Don't specify red here. Okay. So next one. Okay, so this is same HTML as I said, and this one is a really simple rule. This is just div, or this is simple rule, simple selector here. It's just div, and the other one is an ID of pizza, right? So this is the user's custom style sheet, and this is the author CSS, right? So div, the most direct one or the most immediate ancestor of this pizza element, or this EM element with pizza in it as the content, is this div. And similarly, the one with the ID here is also pizza, right? So both of these actually specify not the element itself, right? So the element itself has no specification of the colors if this is the only CSS we have. So again, we move up to the parent, which is the paragraph. Again, neither of these specify it. And so then we move up to the div. And now both of these specify contradictory colors here, right? So which one wins? Well, your natural thing would say, wait, this is an ID, right? An ID, this is one ID and this is 0 IDs. But this is important here where this is the author CSS and this is the user's custom style sheet. And we did not put important here. So the author will take precedence in that one, even though we only have one element here, whereas here we specify one ID, right? So first you take, if there are no important rules, then first you take the author CSS before you even look at the user CSS, right? So this means that the color will be orange, right? And this is again because the user's custom style sheet is for all websites. The author's is more specific to their website. So unless the user says this is a really important rule, it's just going to take the author's CSS. Okay, so let's look at the next one here. What color is the pizza again? So here we have section space div, right? So we're looking inside a section element for a div. Now, you might say, okay, that's this. But the most immediate relevant one, right, is going to be this. So this would actually specify, this section space div actually specifies this, but it also specifies this. So it's saying the color of this div, the text in this div should be orange, but it's also saying this one should be orange. And again, this is the one we care about because it's the most immediate parent, so it has the best chance of being applied to the pizza, right? And here we have .fresh space .food. So this one, right, well, we look inside a fresh class, right? We look at an element inside a fresh class for a food class, right? So you say, okay, this is most immediate, right? This is the element itself, this is a div. And so you would say the color is red, right? Two classes versus two elements. Classes win, right? 0 IDs in both cases is author CSS. And then we go to classes. This has 2 classes and this has 0 classes, right? Wrong, right? So this was again like the one we had done in class. This does not specify this element because remember, since there's a space there, it's saying look inside the EM element or look inside an element with that belonging to a fresh class for an element that has belongs to a food class. Well, there is no such element, right? This belongs to the fresh and the food class, but there's nothing inside this EM element that belongs to the food class, right? So it was not red, it's orange, right? So again, this rule doesn't even apply, so this sort of wins by default, right? I don't know, you could say this one's disqualified, right? So anyway, it's nothing specifies this, so it looks up to the parent, and then it looks up to the grandparent. So it really wasn't relevant that section space div was actually applying to both of these. We could have just said, even if it just applied to just this one, right, it still would have won because if this didn't have any styling associated with it, you would just go up to the parent, right? So instead of using this is the element, this is the parent, this is the grandparent, instead of using the grandparent, you use the great-grandparent, right? So anyway, that's a long-winded way of saying that the color is orange. Okay, so what about this one here? So in this one we have pound menu greater than div, and this one we have section space div. And again, just in case you weren't doing this, you want to pause the video to try to solve this yourself. So if you did and you feel you know what the answer is, let's go over it again. So this one, we couldn't do like what we did before, which was we said, oh, this applies to, this look inside this element, and we could use either div, because this means an immediate child, right? So this specifies this div right here. This is an immediate child. This is a grandchild. So we're not talking about this one for this rule, right? This one only applies to this div right here. Whereas this one, right, section space div, right, could apply to both of these because there's no greater than sign there, right? So again, you're saying, well, this one has one ID, right? These are both author CSS. This one has one ID. This has 0 IDs. This has to win, right? Well, the problem is when you go and look at the which color to use, the EM element, its color is not specified there, so it looks up to the parent. Paragraph, the color is not specified there, so it looks up to this parent here. And this is the only rule that applies at that point, right? This one is not even in contention yet, so it doesn't even get to do battle with this one, right? So it winds up just using this one here because it's specifying a grandparent instead of a great-grandparent, right? So this also specifies the great-grandparent, but it specifies the grandparent as well, so this gets applied and the color is red. Oh, don't toggle. Okay, so let's look at this next one here. So in this one here, we have div.row space div pound pizza, and this we have section pound menu space div.intro. So again, we look through what it's specifying, what elements it's specifying. So div.row without the space, right, says that it's a div that belongs to the class row. And we look inside of this for a div with an ID of pizza, right? Because again, there's a space here, but there's no space between the div and the hashtag or pound pizza, right? So we're talking about this div right here. And this one says section with an ID of menu, that's this. Look inside for a div with a class of intro, that's this. Not immediate child, that's fine, there's no greater than. So once again, they're both specifying the grandparent, right? So now they're going to do battle, right? These are both author CSS. So who's going to win this one? Oh, this one's going to go down to the wire, right? So this one has one ID, and this one has one ID, right? And this has one class, the dot row, and this has one class, the dot intro. And this has two elements, right? Both divs. And this has two elements, a section and a div, right? So now, what do we do, right? Well, what's the final tiebreaker? The final tiebreaker, the tie goes to the one that appears last, right? So in this case, we wind up using the color red, right? So how'd you do? You do well? You prepared for the quiz? So hopefully you had some fun with it. It's actually a little more fun to make that video for these 6 questions so far than I thought. I guess I just enjoy talking to myself and pretending you're all there. Anyway, so let's go on to the next one. So the HTML here is going to be the same thing. The CSS is going to be a little different in that we're not actually dealing with colors anymore, right? So here we're saying the font weight is bold and the font style is normal, and here we're saying the font style is italic, right? And this, by the way, is a browser default CSS, so it's lowest on the totem pole of author, user, and browser defaults are only going to be used when the author and the user don't specify it. So, I mean, like if you don't actually specify, for instance, a background color, right, it defaults to white. The text color defaults to black, right? You get a sans serif. You don't get a sans serif font. You get a serif font, right? These are all browser defaults. Okay, so over here, this is specifying hashtag pizza space P, right? So hashtag pizza, right? ID of pizza and a paragraph, right? And this one specifies the EM. So again, this one certainly more specific, right? And that we're using author CSS versus the browser default, right? Author wins over browser, and you also have an ID here. Here you don't have an ID, right? So you're thinking like, oh, this is sort of the clear winner here. But again, it's not because it doesn't specify the element directly. It doesn't actually go in contention for this. So when these two things conflict, right, it doesn't even get to the point where it checks that the font style should be normal according to this, and the font style should be italic, and it says which one's more specific, because in some ways the more specific one here is the one that directly specifies the element here, right? It's not the parent that we care about, it's the element itself. If we have that rule available to us, that's more specific. So the font style italic wins over the font style normal. However, that doesn't mean that the font weight bold, which doesn't conflict with this rule, can't also be applied, right? So this EM element will inherit its font weight from this paragraph here, or its parent paragraph here, but it just goes and uses the font style. It uses the italic for the browser default of the EM elements, right? So it doesn't actually use this font style normal because this is specifying the element itself and this is specifying a parent. So it's going to be font weight of bold and a font style of italic. It's going to merge those two styles. So bold font weight and italic font style. Okay, so the next one, a little different here than the ones we were doing before. Not as fun, I guess, but important. So given the following HTML and CSS, select all of the following that will be centered on the page. So what's important to remember here is that when you do span of text align center, that's not going to work. So text align center is for, if you remember, it's for block level elements. So it says center my inline content, right? So if you're dealing with an inline element, that's not going to work, right? So when you want to say which of the following are going to be centered on the page, right? So if we look at, for instance, spans the first, right, up here, then we see that spans the first is inside the paragraph with an ID of first, right? And that we actually say nothing about here. I mean, this we have the span text align center, but that's not going to do anything. But we also say this, its parent is a div whose ID is inner, and this one does say the text align center. So this says center my inline content. Now, this, right, is part of the paragraph. I mean, it's also part of the div, but the div is actually, well, if you take the span itself, the div is just a grandparent here. So it's not the grandparent when he's saying center my inline content, right? It's the fact that it's inherited by this paragraph, right? So this paragraph is also a block level element, and since we don't specify otherwise, the paragraph inherits the text align center from its parent, so it's going to say center my inline content, and since this is on its own line, notice the line breaks there, right? This is going to get centered. So spans the first is going to get centered, but spans the second, right? Second is not the second paragraph is not actually a descendant of inner; it's a descendant of outer. So this rule is not going to apply. The image rule certainly doesn't apply, and the span won't help, right? So, because again, the span is an inline element. So spans the second is not going to be centered. Now, what about the image itself? Well, the image is sort of a block inline element, but for these purposes, like center my inline content, it doesn't have inline content. So this one is not going to be centered either. Okay, and finally, which of the following can be used to select exactly the unvisited active, those are the currently being clicked on links, contained inside a div, right? So if we're doing inside a div, right, there should be a space here. So I didn't mean to select that, I just mean to select the spaces here, right? So things like div colon link, right, none of these are going to work, right, if there's no space in between, right? So we're looking at one of these with the spaces. And it should be unvisited and active, right? So active, this means it's in the active pseudo class, right? This means it's a link, an anchor element, right? But unvisited, right? You don't write it as unvisited. You write it as link. So what we're looking for here, anchor elements that belong to the link pseudo class and the active pseudo class, right? So it's div space a colon link colon active. So again, the link means unvisited. You don't use the unvisited for that. Okay, so hopefully you did well in that homework quiz and you're prepared for the in-class quiz. Again, it's sad we weren't able to go through the first 6 questions at least in class. I felt that was always fun, livened up the class. But oh well, we'll have to do with what we have here. So hopefully you still enjoyed it. Maybe you played it with some friends. I doubt you did. But anyway, that concludes the Chapter 10 homework quiz solutions here and concludes this video, and we can see that everything was correct. Okay, so good luck on the quiz and hope you enjoyed this.